Is the first lecture in our series, Terror in the 21st Century, al-Qaida, ISIS, and their affiliates. This series is offered in partnership with the Middle East Center at the University of Pennsylvania, our longtime and also future partner in a number of programs on the topic. We're very fortunate tonight to have as our speaker Cole Bunzel, who is a Ph.D. student at Princeton University. He received his MA in International Relations from Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and an AB from Princeton in Near Eastern Studies. His research focuses on Wahhabism in Saudi Arabia and on the jihadi Salafi movement, all of which he'll explain. His dissertation examines the origins and evolution of Wahhabism and its appropriation by the jihadi Salafi movement beginning in the 1980s. Now, Cole has published a number of scholarly works, including From Paper State to Caliphate, the Ideology of the Islamic State, which was an analysis paper for the Brookings Project in U.S. relations with the Islamic world, and also The Kingdom and the Caliphate, Duel, D-U-E-L, of the Islamic States, a publication of the Carnegie Endowment, as well as other scholarly works. Please give Cole Bunzel a welcome to Camden County College. One last thing, I always forget this, and my colleague reminded me of it. Please turn off your cell phones. I meant to say that before every talk, and I get in front of the mic and somehow it disappears. Maybe it's electronic phenomena or something. Cole.
Hi, thanks. Thank you all for coming, and thanks to the center at Camden County College and the Middle East Center at the University of Pennsylvania for putting this speaker series together and for having me. And it really is, I've taken a look at it, a distinguished group of speakers, excluding myself, that you have. So I would certainly recommend attending all of the other talks. And mine is, as you see, perhaps on a rather obscure and specific subject, but I'll try and weave it into the broader picture of the jihadi movement. And so the lecture, as it's titled, is Jihadism in Saudi Arabia, and I'll just dissect that very quickly. So what I mean by jihadism is the ideological movement to which both al-Qaida and the Islamic State belong. So if I were giving this kind of talk 5 years ago, I probably could have just said al-Qaida in Saudi Arabia. But now we have two groups that both are claiming to represent something, and the word in Arabic that they use is usually jihadi Salafism or a Salafiyya al-Jihadiyya. So they have a term for the movement to which they belong, and I'll explain this in a bit more detail as we go along. And the shorter term for that is also jihadiyya or jihadism. When it comes to the other term, Saudi Arabia, I should tell you that there are about 3 reasons why it is important to focus on Saudi Arabia if you're trying to understand the jihadi movement that encompasses both al-Qaida and the Islamic State. One, of course, is that there are a lot of Saudis, particularly young Saudi men, who join and in fact lead these movements. So Osama bin Laden, as you all know, was a Saudi citizen, though he was actually of Yemeni origin. 15 of the 19 hijackers on 9/11 were Saudis. Hundreds, if not thousands, of the men who joined ISIS are Saudis, and a lot of the men who make up their scholarly ranks are also of Saudi origin. So that first reason is personnel. The second reason has to do with the ideology of the jihadi movement. So there's a very close ideological relationship between the movement known as Wahhabism, which is the specific form of Islam in Saudi Arabia, and the jihadi movement. And both Saudi Arabia and the jihadis claim to represent this movement that was founded in the 18th century in Saudi Arabia, which is a Puritan movement, and I'll speak about that more as well. And then the third reason, of course, is that Saudi Arabia has been the target of a whole lot of jihadi extremist attacks, including recently with ISIS. There's been a wave of attacks, though it hasn't amounted to a kind of insurrection or revolution. It has been something that caused a great deal of death and carnage. So, and in fact, if you listen to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the leader of the Islamic State, one of the things that he has said is that Saudi Arabia is the head of the snake. So the idea there is that Saudi Arabia is, in fact, the main target of these jihadi groups. We often think that the United States and the West, that we are, what they're most concerned with. But when you look at their literature, what they often talk about is that this is what they want. They want to recover the territory in the Middle East, and particularly this territory, because it's the place where Islam emerges in the 7th century. So just real quickly, I'll run through what it is I'll be talking about. First, I'll give you some background on Saudi Arabia as a country, some geography and demography, its politics and history, including primarily the Wahhabi movement, which is part of its history. And then I'll talk about the Jihadi Salafi movement, particularly its origins related to al-Qaida and al-Qaida's activities inside Saudi Arabia, particularly in the early 2000s. And then I'll get into the rise of the Islamic State, how it differs from al-Qaida. I'll try not to get into too much theological detail. And then I'll talk about that movement's ambitions and activities in Saudi Arabia as well. So to begin, this is Saudi Arabia. Many of you are probably familiar with this map. It's in the center of the Middle East. It's one of the most important countries in the Middle East. Some would argue it's the most important country in the Middle East. You can see it's between the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf, shares a long border with Iraq. It's actually geographically the largest country in the Middle East. It's about a quarter the size of the continental United States, but it is not by any means the most populous country in the Middle East. It has about 32 million people, I believe. About 8 million of those are expatriate workers, mostly from the Philippines and Pakistan and India. So the reason I chose this map here is because it shows you the concentrations of the population. So those dark regions on the left and in the center and on the right, those represent where the people are actually located. So Riyadh is in the center here, and that's the capital. And there's an area here called Nejd, or Central Arabia, which is kind of the origin of Saudi Arabia, where political power emerges. And it expanded outward. So on the west, you have Mecca and Medina and Jeddah. Those are the areas, this is called the Hijaz. That's where Islam emerges in the 7th century. So it's very important symbolically to have that territory inside Saudi Arabia. And part of Saudi Arabia's claim to legitimacy is that it is it's the guardians of Mecca and Medina, of the two holy places of Islam. Now, in the East, there are two things that are important for Saudi history and modern politics. One is the Shia. So there is about 10% of the population, or 10 to 15, that is Shia. And I won't get into the theological divisions between the Sunnis and the Shia, but suffice it to say that the majority is Sunni, and if you want to get deeper, they're actually Wahhabi, and the Shia have the same religion, the same form of Islam as southern Iraq and Iran. So they have different views about the origins and the theology of Islam. So there's a concentration of Shia in the east, and there's also oil. Almost all of the oil in Saudi Arabia is to be found just next to where the Shia live. And so you can see how close Kuwait over here is to northeastern Saudi Arabia. When Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1990, the oil fields were very close to Kuwait, and that's why the United States was asked to supply troops to prevent Iraq from acquiring the oil fields there. So that is an introduction to the geography and demography of Saudi Arabia. And oil is important for another reason, and that is because developmentally, Saudi Arabia has become dependent on oil to employ its citizens. So about 70% of the country is employed by the state, which is like a crazy number of people to be employed by the government. So if you go to a Starbucks in Riyadh, you won't be served by Saudis. You'll be served by people from the Philippines or from Pakistan. And Saudis would tell you that it would just be wrong for somebody who is Saudi to be working at Starbucks. So you have this kind of class-based society based around whether you are Saudi or whether you are not. And it's a different and interesting dynamic from what you have in a country like this. Turning to a brief history of Saudi Arabia, the official name of the country is the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. So what that tells you right off the bat is that it is first and foremost a kingdom. It's an absolute monarchy and it has a king. It was founded in 1932 as the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia by this man. His name is King Abdul Aziz ibn Saud, who dies in 1953. He's usually known as Ibn Saud in English. And the kingdom he founds in 1932, this is the flag, and one of the symbolic things you'll note about the flag is that it has the Muslim profession of faith on it. La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah. There is no God but God. Muhammad is the messenger of God. And what that tells you is that Islam is very important for the legitimacy of the country. The sword, there are different stories about what the sword represents, but I won't speculate. But I think it has something to do with the fact that the country wasn't indeed united by a unity of religion and politics. So the idea behind the Saudi state has to do with an alliance between a particular form of Islam, which is called Wahhabism, and the Saudi ruling family. So that was another thing I wanted to mention about the country of Saudi Arabia, is that the very title is kind of an oddity in the region. So Saudi Arabia isn't a country like Egypt or Iran that has thousands of years of civilization and history to it. It's actually a pretty modern idea. And that's why the government has to put the name of the ruling dynasty in the title of the country. So which is Saud. So Saud is the name of a particular family. So it's a little like calling America Trumplandia today, and then that going on for centuries. So just keep that in mind. So the jihadis, in fact, the people like in al-Qaida and the Islamic State, they won't refer to it as Saudi Arabia because that's heresy. It doesn't belong to the Saudi family in their view. It belongs to them. It belongs to Islam. So they call it the peninsula of Muhammad or the Arabian Peninsula, and they refer to the El Saud family as the El Salul, and there are lots of these kinds of name tricks in the jihadi world. The Salul is a reference to an early hypocrite who was an opponent of the Prophet Muhammad in 7th century Arabia, who made alliances with Jews in secret. You see there's lots of fancy imagery. So you'll often hear, if you were looking, even in the English publications of ISIS, references to the El Salul, not the El Saud. They won't talk about it like that. But what they do like is this is the jihadis. What they really appreciate is the early story of the Islamic State in Saudi Arabia. So the modern country of Saudi Arabia, which looks pretty much like this on the right today, it is the revival of an earlier model of the Saudi state, which existed between 1745 and 1818. And that state began as an alliance between two men, Muhammad ibn Saud and Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab. Excuse me. So that alliance between a chieftain, Ibn Saud, who was the ruler of a small oasis town, and Ibn Abdul Wahhab, who was a controversial preacher, produced a state-building enterprise that intertwined religion and politics and managed to create a state that went from something like this in this is about 1760, to something like this in 1800. So it just takes over the whole peninsula in a way that had never been done since the 7th century. It's a dramatic change to the politics of the country, and that alliance between the Saud family and the Wahhabi form of religion promoted by Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, that transcends these two men, and it becomes an enduring alliance between the family of the Saud and the family of Ibn Abdul Wahhab. So the El Saud and the El Sheikh, or the family of the Sheikh. So this early Saudi religious project was a deeply conservative, puritanical Islamic state that was jointly ruled by a Saudi political ruler and a Wahhabi cleric. That is basically the idea. And this is something that that the jihadis today look to as a model, as something that they aspire to creating. And in fact, there are a lot of similarities between the early Wahhabi state and the Islamic State of Iraq and Sham, or ISIS as we see it today, because this early political project in Saudi Arabia, or in the Arabian Peninsula, was seen as an extremely radical project. Yes, sir?
Question. So when
Yeah.
this joint organization to rule the country, they were both of the Sunni religion? Were they both followers of Sunni religions? So is there, the Wahhabi is one version of Sunni, and then there's a non-Wahhabi version? Am I correct? Because I'm kind of confused here.
Right. Let me simplify it. So basically, this is Wahhabism, and it's preached by the man named Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, and it's named for him as well. He doesn't actually like the name Wahhabism. They all call themselves Muslims, and the name for their movement is just Islam. The problem is you can't really use that word because they're excluding everyone else from Islam. So the Saudi rulers also adhere to Wahhabism. So they kind of take his teachings as truth, and they say, we agree with you that this is the correct form of Islam, and we're going to promote that form of Islam across the Arabian Peninsula by the sword. So that was the idea. So it became a vehicle of expansion, of state formation in the Arabian Peninsula. And most of the Sunni Muslim, I'm trying not to make this complicated. Wahhabism is a Sunni form of Islam, but when it emerges, the vast majority of Sunni Muslims see it as a heresy. So they don't believe that it is true Islam. It's kind of like today when ISIS claims to be the true representative of Islam. It's a Sunni movement, but the vast majority of Sunni Muslims consider it a heresy. That's kind of the parallelism that you have. The reason why Wahhabism was so controversial was basically for three things. The first is that it was a purist form of Islam. Its catchphrase was Tawheed, or pure monotheism, and basically what it wanted to do was tell people who were worshiping at shrines that they were not allowed to do so. So saint veneration was a very big part of Islam in this day and age, and according to Wahhabism, that was anathema, and those people needed to be corrected. So it was intolerant of other forms of Islam, and it referred to the people who were worshiping at shrines as polytheists. And it was also activist in its outlook and in its mentality. So in order to be a true Muslim, according to Wahhabism, you not only had to agree with the Wahhabi version of Islam, but you also had to do something about it. You had to confront those who did not agree with the Wahhabi faith, and to call them out and to tell them that they were polytheists. And over time, that obligation developed into an obligation to wage war on behalf of the Saudi state. So you can imagine this is an extremely controversial thing in the Islamic world. And of course, jihad in this context means armed struggle. So jihad can mean many things. Etymologically, what it means, that is just at base, what it really means is striving. But one of its legal meanings is striving on behalf of Islam, and that can mean a military struggle. And that's what it means here. And the purpose of this military struggle in Wahhabism was the elimination of polytheism. So just to give you a sense of what this kind of language was that's used in the epistles and the other literature that was produced by the Wahhabis, this is something that Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, the founder of Wahhabism, he said, we are fighting them, that is the polytheists, on account of polytheism, as God says, and here he quotes from the Quran, fight them till there is no persecution, i.e. polytheism, and the religion is God's entirely. So the idea is we're purifying the world of polytheism, and we're promoting Islam at the expense of the polytheists. Now the early Wahhabi state, as you can see here, started to expand northward towards Iraq and Syria. And there was something there called the Ottoman Empire that was getting in the way. And the Ottoman Empire didn't like this Saudi Wahhabi project and thought that it needed to be destroyed. And eventually, in 1818, it did destroy it. But before then, you had some correspondence between the Saudi rulers and the Ottoman authorities that was not very mutually, you can say, kind. So they both accused each other of being infidels, and they both wanted to, fight each other in jihad. So this is something that the Saudi ruler Saud wrote to the Ottoman governor of Baghdad in about 1810. He says, as for what you mentioned that we kill the unbelievers, this is something for which we make no apology, and that we do not minimize. We will do more of it, God willing. We will eradicate the falsehood from your lands. Now, there are more things he says here that are not really quotable, such as, I'll say it. I hope you die upon your Christian religion and are among the pigs of hellfire. He says that to the ruler of Baghdad in 1810. Yes, sir.
So when you say polytheism, you mean like non-Muslim religions? Is that because in the writings of the Quran, from what I understand,
Yeah.
Muhammad accepted other religions, Christian. So that is not being consistent with the Quran, if that's what you mean by polytheism.
Right, so the gentleman correctly points out that the Quran is tolerant in some way of other religions. But here, when the founder of Wahhabism is mentioning polytheism, he means actually professed Muslims who have the wrong beliefs. So he means heretical Muslims. He's extremely intolerant and inflammatory. It's like if I called you a polytheist, how would you feel? It's like extremely upsetting to people. Well, maybe you wouldn't be upset, but
Going back to the Quran,
yeah.
the Quran says a Muslim does not kill another Muslim. So going back to the founding document,
Yes.
Quran. So they're not following the Quran.
Oh, well, you sound exactly like some of the opponents of Wahhabism who made just these arguments. They would say you can't fight fellow Muslims, you can't excommunicate fellow Muslims, this is contrary to Islam. And he would say, well, you're not Muslims, what are you talking about? We've never excommunicated and fought Muslims, we're fighting you. That was, these kinds of theological debates, they have an extraordinary relevance today when we talk about what's going on with ISIS and al-Qaida. This is the way that ISIS is addressing al-Qaida in some of its commentary. It's such loggerheads at the moment, and this is the way that they refer to other opponents. Like when they talk about the Saudi regime, they call them polytheists. So there's a lot to this heritage that crops back up. And just if you're curious, the Ottoman governor of Baghdad was born a Christian slave, so there was a reason why he would call the Ottoman governor of Baghdad, kind of refer to him as a Christian. Okay, now we jump very far ahead in history to the Jihadi Salafi movement. Jihadi Salafism really takes form in the 1970s and 1990s. One of the places that it emerges to begin with, is Egypt, and it comes out of the legacy of the Muslim Brotherhood there, which is a completely different history from what I've been speaking of, and I don't want to get into it too deeply, but it's basically starts out as a movement that is influenced by radical ideas coming from Egypt, and is influenced in particular by a man named Sayyid Qutb, who dies in 1967. And one of Qutb's main ideas was something called hakimiyya, which was the idea that we need to give sovereignty to God, so that the only legislator in the country will be God and Islamic law. And so it's very much an idea that is opposed to democracy and modern forms of government that were being practiced in places like Egypt and Syria. Now, the other half of jihadi Salafism was Wahhabism, which comes out of Saudi Arabia, which gives you these purist doctrines of you're a polytheist and an unbeliever, and that very controversial part of the doctrine. And it's also, there's an activism to it, because if you believe that your political opponents are polytheists, then it's your obligation to fight them and to overturn their rule. So this kind of coming together of the Wahhabi or the Saudi and the Egyptian strands of the ideology is symbolized in the union of the al-Qaida leadership in 2000. So this is a picture here of Osama bin Laden on the left, who is a Saudi, and on the right, Ayman al-Zawahiri, who is an Egyptian. Al-Qaida was formed actually before this in 1988 in Afghanistan, but it was only in 2000 that it had its official name given to it, which is the Qaida of Jihad, Qaidat al-Jihad. Ayman Zawahiri, in case you were wondering, he is currently still alive, and he is the leader of al-Qaida, and he actually gives a lot of audio and video statements that appear online and that no longer make the front page of the New York Times, because, at least in our day and age, ISIS is what grabs everyone's attention. Now, al-Qaida became famous for 9/11, but some might say, and I would agree with them, that its main objective was not to attack the United States and to attack the West. It was, in fact, to what they would say, recover the lands of Islam from the heretical rulers that are in possession of them. So one of Osama bin Laden's greatest objectives was to take control of Saudi Arabia from the Saudi rulers. And this started actually translating into policy in 2003. Sure, sir. Yeah, so the gentleman is asking about whether I mean, by Saudi, I mean a member of the royal family or just a citizen of the country. And it's actually a very good question, because it's ambiguous. But what I mean in that sense is that a Saudi citizen. So Osama bin Laden is certainly not a member of the Saudi royal family. He's a Saudi citizen. But there's no other word for somebody who belongs to the Saudi government. I mean, who is a member or a citizen of Saudi Arabia. You could say Saudi Arabians, I suppose. Sometimes that's done. But by and large, when I say Saudi, I just mean a civil member of the country. So in 2003, al-Qaida, at the direction of bin Laden, decides to launch a campaign in Saudi Arabia that will hopefully overturn the government. So between 2003 and 2006, there was a rather small-scale insurgency being waged by al-Qaida, and it came to be known as al-Qaida in the Arabian Peninsula. This is a poster that the group made for a video called Badr al-Riyad, which was celebrating one of the terrorist attacks that it waged during this time. So when the group started carrying out attacks, it basically decided, okay, we're going to try not to be too controversial. We don't want to alienate the population, so we'll focus on Western expatriates. So what they did is they went into compounds. This is the places in Saudi Arabia, in in and around Riyadh, in the capital, where Westerners generally live. They live in these walled, guarded compounds. And they went in there as suicide bombers, and they started killing people. And in one case, they took hostage an American who worked for an oil company, and they beheaded him in a very gruesome fashion in the way that you saw ISIS doing recently. So this caused a lot of controversy. A lot of people left Saudi Arabia at this time. It seemed like the country didn't have a handle on it. But after a couple of years, all of these people were killed. There was a successful crackdown on the group, and the group had to relocate to Yemen, where it continues to this day to be known as al-Qaida in the Arabian Peninsula. Sir.
Can I ask why they consider the Western expatriates polytheists?
Yeah, it's a good question. So there's he asked, and I'm repeating the question for the sake of the audio. He asked why do they consider polytheists to be, the Westerners to be polytheists? So on his, one of the last things that the Prophet Muhammad is alleged to have said is expel the polytheists from the Arabian Peninsula. And that edict does seem to have been carried out because there were these polytheist communities in Arabia that were no longer to be found after the rise of Islam. So while there was toleration of Christianity and Judaism outside of the Arabian Peninsula, the tradition had it that within the Arabian Peninsula there weren't supposed to be Christians, Jews, polytheists of any kind. So here, when they say polytheists, you can relate that to Christianity if you're applying traditional Islamic theology, because Christians have the idea of the Trinity, and in polemical debates over centuries, the Christians were accused of polytheism. They also made similar arguments about the Jews, but the point is that according to al-Qaida, the Arabian Peninsula was supposed to be purified of other religions. So the argument that they made was, we need to purify the Arabian Peninsula, we need to expel the polytheists, which included the Americans who were working for oil companies. Now, at this time, also, American forces were still in Saudi Arabia. This was the time around the beginning of the Iraq War, and it was as a part of the al-Qaida campaign that it prompted the United States to move all of its military forces that were deployed in the region to places like Qatar and Bahrain. But that is the story of al-Qaida in the Arabian Peninsula. Most of their attacks were against Western expatriates, and then there were attacks as the movement went on and became less successful. There were lots of shootouts with Saudi security forces that didn't turn out well for the terrorists, and they died. So, and the ones who survived, they took refuge in Yemen. And today, the movement, the al-Qaida group there, is still known as al-Qaida in the Arabian Peninsula. It still has a lot of Saudis. Yes?
What does the term al-Qaida mean?
So al-Qaida, the term, she asked, what does the term al-Qaida mean? Al-Qaida means the base. Now, you might ask, what does the base mean? And that's a good question, and there are different interpretations of it. Some people think it means a base or a register of fighters who were originally part of the group. The most persuasive argument that I've seen, which is from one of the early members of al-Qaida, was that there was simply a base in an al-Qaida training camp that people called the base, and so they adopted the name. So that seems to... the name doesn't seem to have that much symbolic resonance as it might at first appear. But there are different takes on that. Just wanted to give one further example of the way that al-Qaida in the Arabian Peninsula rationalized jihad. So it was putting out a magazine during this period of time, and this is from one of its editorials, The Land of the Two Holy Places. And when it says the land of the two holy places, what it means is the entirety of Saudi Arabia. So you can see that they're deliberately not using the term Saudi in order to avoid the association with the Saudi ruling family. So the land of the two holy places is one of the locations where jihad is most obligatory and necessary, for in it is the occupying crusader enemy. that is us, which steals her treasure, writes her policies, and makes war on the Muslims. In it also is the client apostate regime. So they're really covering all the bases. The crusader enemy, that's the United States and its people, and the apostate regime, that's the Saudi government, which implements the imperialist plans, shows loyalty to the unbelievers, and rules not in accordance with God's law. So if you were to make a long list of the reasons why al-Qaida and groups like it deem the Saudi government to be unbelievers, it would be rather long. But it would include all of these things, that they don't implement God's law, that they are allied with the unbelievers, and that the unbelievers are there and they're allowed to live and to work, and that the rulers are apostates for all of these reasons. But after 2006, there really isn't much activity inside of Saudi Arabia because of a very effective crackdown by the Saudi security forces. But in 2014, you would see another string of attacks launched, this time not by a group calling itself al-Qaida, but a group calling itself the Islamic State, which, in order to understand, you have to go back a little bit further in time to the origins of the Islamic State. And I won't cover this in too much depth because I know Joby Warwick is coming here and he'll give you his whole spiel about Zarqawi and the origins of ISIS, and it's an excellent spiel, I can tell you. But this picture right here is Abu Musab Zarqawi. He is something like the ideological founder of ISIS. He comes from Jordan, and he belongs to the jihadi Salafi movement. He fights in Afghanistan. He leads a jihadi group in Jordan. But during all of this time, he belongs to a harder line version of jihadism. He is more intolerant, more purist, more uncompromising in his ideology. And another way to think of it is he's more Wahhabi. He's more like those Wahhabis who are so intolerant of the other that I was talking about before. So he actually had a very difficult, tenuous relationship with Osama bin Laden because Osama bin Laden was a bit more tolerant of other kinds of Muslims. Bin Laden didn't really go on tirades about the Shia and how the Shia were destroying Islam from the inside out. That wasn't his theme, but it was very much Zarqawi's theme, and it applied very well in Iraq, where there was a large Shia presence, in fact, a majority. So when he goes to Iraq in 2003 and founds a group that ultimately becomes the Islamic State of Iraq, that group is a sectarian movement that is trying to foment a civil war with the Shia, and it actually has a difficult relationship with al-Qaida, though they belong to the same movement. So he dies shortly before a group that is called the Islamic State of Iraq is formed. And that group, the Islamic State of Iraq, as you all know, would become in 2013 to be known as the Islamic State of Iraq and Hashem when it expands into Syria. It claims that it is expanding its territory and retitling itself. And then in 2014, it claims that we are now the awaited Caliphate, and our territory is going to encompass an even greater percentage of the globe, hopefully the entire globe, which is something to which al-Qaida objects. But the point of all this is just to tell you that in November 2014, the leader of ISIS, or the Islamic State, he gives a speech where he says, I'm establishing a new set of provinces. And and these are provinces, I put that in parentheses because they don't actually control these territories. He says, we're establishing a province in a land of the two holy places, i.e. Saudi Arabia, but they don't have any territory there. But the announcement was significant because beginning in November 2014, there was a series of attacks in Saudi Arabia designed to overturn or to overthrow the Saudi ruling government. And following it might look like a whole lot of blood, but that's really the color of the carpet. So, but I do mean to show this as a scene of an attack. This was an attack in May 2015 in the eastern province. So if you recall, I mentioned that the Shia are concentrated in the east of the country. So it was ISIS's objective to attack the Shia in order to kind of to alienate the people from the Saudi government, to make the Saudi government look tolerant of the Shia and divide society along sectarian lines in the way that had been done in Iraq. So when Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi outlines his strategy for what we're going to do in Saudi Arabia, he says this: "O sons of the lands of the two holy places, there is no place for the polytheists on the peninsula of the Prophet Muhammad. So unsheathe your swords. Start first with the Shia, wherever you find them, then the house of Salul and their soldiers, before the Crusaders and their bases." So you'll see that the terminology that I introduced is starting to become relevant. The House of Salul, of course, is the Saudi government and the regime and its soldiers and police officers and things like that. But the targets are in order of importance: the Shia, then the Saudi government, and then the West. And if you notice, it's basically the opposite of what al-Qaida in the Arabian Peninsula was doing. They were starting with the West, then the Saudi government, and, well, they didn't even have a place for the Shia because that wasn't their idea. They didn't believe in fomenting sectarian civil strife. But that was ISIS's strategy. So that's what they started to do. And they didn't attack Westerners at all, except for in one case where they killed a Danish man, it seemed kind of like a fluke. I went to Saudi Arabia several times during this. I never felt unsafe because I didn't go to the eastern province where all of this violence was taking place. It was against Shia mosques. So this is a scene in a Shia mosque where a Saudi suicide bomber had gone. And in the ISIS's propaganda, they refer to these not as mosques, but as temples, as polytheist temples. And one of the things that they do in their propaganda is show that the early Saudi government, the one from the 18th century that I talked about before, when it invaded and conquered the east of the Arabian Peninsula in around the 1790s, it also attacked and destroyed Shia shrines. Of course, they didn't have bombs and they didn't have suicide bombers, but there is a symmetry, which is kind of embarrassing to the modern Saudi regime, which is trying to distance itself from a lot of this legacy. But similar to the AQAP, or the al-Qaida campaign that ended in around 2006, the ISIS campaign basically lost momentum in 2017, last year, and there hasn't been a successful attack in about a year. And the reason, it seems to be twofold. One is the same reason why AQAP wasn't able to take hold of the government, which was that the security forces were very effective. And part of the reason that they're very effective is that Saudi Arabia is not a very poor country. It's a country with a lot of money, a lot of resources. So it has the ability to be a very effective authoritarian government, which it is. So there's that. The second reason was that ISIS was failing to inspire further attacks because it was losing territory in Iraq and Syria. So the failure of ISIS in Iraq and Syria translated into failure in the so-called provinces as well, which were becoming less animated the less ISIS managed to show that it was being a successful potential political entity that was going to expand. Basically, the dream seemed to be dying. And the idea of stoking a Shi'i-Sunni kind of civil war in Saudi Arabia, it wasn't panning out. It wasn't translating into anything real on the ground. So effectively, there probably will still be some ISIS-inspired and ISIS-planned and executed attacks in Saudi Arabia this year and in the coming years. But if you talk to Saudi officials today, they're not worried about this as a kind of existential crisis that could unseat the government. They don't believe that the Sunni jihadis are going to take over, that they represent a serious threat to their rule. But they do see it, I think rightly, as an enduring threat. So it's a threat that will continue to be found, but it's not a threat that is going to to change the constitution of the government there in Saudi Arabia. And I tend to agree with that outlook. So the last thing that I'll talk about is, just briefly, the rise of a new crown prince in Saudi Arabia. So this picture here is of a man who is 32 years old. His name is Mohammed bin Salman, and he's been the crown prince of Saudi Arabia since last year. And in that role, he's actually been more or less the ruler of the country. His father, Salman, who is the present king of Saudi Arabia, he is one of the last surviving sons of the original founder of the kingdom. So remember the picture from way back, that was the guy who founded the kingdom in 1932. He was actually fighting in 1902. That's when he started to put together the kingdom of Saudi Arabia. It was in 1902. His son is currently the king of Saudi Arabia. That's how many children he had. And we can talk about that if you're curious, but he had, it's an estimated more than 100 wives over the course of his life. And the number of children is just countless. But Mohammed bin Salman represents something very, very new and very, very interesting in Saudi Arabia, because he is the first ruler from the next generation of Saudis. And his appeal that he is trying to generate is that he's representing something younger and something newer and fresher, and something that's going to distance the government from its roots in Wahhabism, Salafism, and this kind of intolerant version of Islam. So what he has been saying is that he wants to return the country to moderate Islam. Now, I would argue, and others have argued, that there was no moderate Islam to return to, because Saudi Arabia's history is not one of moderate Islam. It's one of extremist Islam that is subdued by politics, by realpolitik. But in any event, in my opinion, it's a very positive thing that he is trying to embrace a more moderate form of Islam. And so what you see is recently there have been relaxations on religious rules in the country. The religious police, which used to drive around, still does drive around, but it doesn't police so much because it lost its authority to arrest. So the religious police no longer walks around malls telling women and men that they shouldn't be together, which makes an enormous difference for daily life in Saudi Arabia. It's an incredible transformation. And next year, beginning in June, women will be allowed to drive. Women are now allowed to be at sporting events and concerts with men at the same time. So these are huge, major changes in Saudi society. And the way that the jihadis are reacting to this is they're saying, look, this man, he's not even trying anymore. He's not even trying to say that he's a Wahhabi, that he's a conservative Muslim. He's bringing back, as they say, polytheism. This is what is the term here you'll see in this piece of ISIS propaganda that I'm showing you. So that is the tension that you see today. So it creates a room for more, basically it creates the potential for more jihadi attacks in Saudi Arabia going into the future. But hopefully it will kind of moderate the Islam that is being generated from Saudi Arabia to begin with. And with that, I've mostly covered what I wanted to cover. I don't know how much time, but I did have two more things to say briefly. Right, so takeaways. If there were two takeaways I could give you that this talk might have, one would be that the majority of jihadi violence that we see today and read about in the news is perpetrated against not the United States and the West, but against fellow Muslims. It's generally Muslim on Muslim violence, and most of it is in the Middle East, and most of it is violence that is about the Middle East. Even the violence that is against the West, that is against Westerners, it's usually about the Middle East to begin with. So all those attacks in Saudi Arabia in 2003 to 2006 that were against Westerners, it was really about taking control of Saudi Arabia. So in a sense, attacking the West is like attacking a proxy for something else. it's not its real objective. Its real objective is gaining control of territory in the Middle East, and we are kind of, we're a pawn in this game. And the second takeaway would be that this is something that the case of Saudi Arabia and jihadism seems to exemplify. It's that if you have strong political institutions, if you have political stability and socioeconomic stability in these countries, you can avoid the jihadi problem. You can't stop it entirely. So Saudi Arabia still was affected to a pretty large degree by this problem, but it was able to contain it as a terrorist threat and not see it take control of the country because it was able to maintain its stability. And if you look at the countries in the region that have failed to maintain stability, Iraq, Syria, Libya, those are the places where jihadism has dropped the deepest roots. It's a movement that feeds on instability and migrates to instability. And so if you want to prevent the problem from festering, from getting out of control, you have to do what Saudi Arabia has done, which is to keep a lid on it and keep politics rather stable. Now, most countries in the region don't have the financial resources to do that. So it begs the question, how do you do that elsewhere in the region? And I don't have the answer. But Saudi Arabia does kind of point in the direction of one way to fight the problem. Thanks.